welcome back to the Mindful Living Summit. My name is Kaylee Isaacs, and I'm the founder of the Awake Network. I'll be your host for this session. Today, we're exploring what mindfulness in everyday looks like, and I'm happy to be here with Dr. Mark Bertin, talking about attention, shaping healthy habits, and the building blocks of mindful living. Dr. Bertin is a developmental pediatrician and author of How Children Thrive, Mindful Parenting for ADHD, and the Family ADHD Solution, which integrate mindfulness into evidence-based pediatric care. He's also a contributing author of the book Teaching Mindfulness Skills to Kids and Teens, a regular contributor at Mindful Magazine, and his blog is available through mindful.org and Psychology Today. Dr. Bertin, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Today we're talking about mindfulness in everyday life and how we can stabilize our attention. And so to start off, could you lead us through a brief guided practice where we can focus our attention right now?
Of course, that'd be great. It's a good start to anything, I think. So sure, why don't we just take a moment to do just a brief breathing practice then. So for anyone listening, why don't you just take a moment wherever you are right now, maybe except if you're driving and listening. But for everyone else, find yourself a seat. And if you're comfortable, lower your gaze and shut your eyes. You might even check in for a moment on where your thoughts are right now, where your attention is. And then begin to bring your awareness to that physical sensation your body makes with each breath. And you might even label it breathing in and breathing out. And letting go of any sense of needing to do anything with your breath, needing to change anything. Just patiently noticing each time your mind wanders off somewhere else and then coming back again. And then when you're ready, opening your eyes. And joining us again in our discussion for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Bertin. So now that we've briefly touched in on a practice of mindfulness and attention, I'd like to ask you what the connection is between the two, between mindfulness and attention.
It's a great start. It's actually something that comes up an awful lot, but I think, mindfulness most often gets this defined as something like giving more moment-to-moment awareness, moment-to-moment unbiased awareness to our lives. And really, even when you talk about the title of the session, I think in the bigger picture, most of us who are practicing mindfulness would, really describe it as a way of trying to look at how we're relating to day-to-day life differently. So, mindfulness isn't about meditation in particular. Meditation's sort of a way of building traits that we hopefully let us live our lives a little more easily. So that starts often with just recognizing that without putting a little effort into it, our attention tends to be all over the place. Years ago, a teacher named Mark Coleman led me on an exercise where he had us try to pay attention to nothing. And you find out really quickly that that's really not what the mind does. You're always paying attention to something. It tends to quite often be, caught up in thoughts of the future or the past or ruminating over problems or all these different habitual places we go. And if we want to live life more mindfully with more awareness, we want to relate as skillfully as we can to whatever's going on, that starts with recognizing that we're not paying attention to what's actually going on an awful lot of the time. And that has a lot of implications. We want to start breaking that habit if we can.
And so when it comes to doing work to cultivate our ability to focus our attention, why is that something that we might want to do? What are some of the benefits of that?
Well, I think it starts from just the beginning concept we often talk about is getting out of autopilot, is just recognizing that anytime we're doing anything without giving it our full attention, it has like a cascade of implications. I mean, some of it is just missing out, some of it is just recognizing that there are all these mental biases that go on. Our minds tend to get caught up in stuff. It's sometimes called the negativity bias. We're caught up in stuff. It's probably, has value. It's an evolutionary trait we probably developed where our mind gets, really heightened awareness of anything that seems off or bad or dangerous, because, in essence, from a survival point of view, it helps us pick out the things that might put us in danger. But on a day-to-day level, it does sort of mean we might miss out on easier moments if we don't give them our attention. And that's certainly a beginning benefit to just catching ourselves and maybe giving full attention to our cup of coffee in the morning or our kids is a nice, way of creating more balance in our lives. But then the bigger implication often is that really in any moment that we're doing stuff and not giving it our attention, we're on autopilot. We're just kind of doing whatever we've always done, and that is fine sometimes, I suppose, but it does mean that we're not allowing for choice and we're not approaching problems more flexibly. We're sort of just living our life in ruts almost. And that really is where the bigger practice of mindfulness comes in, is just recognizing that whatever is going on in life, we can choose to do the same old, or we can try to catch ourselves and see with clarity and, and maybe allow for change more often, or at least, try to be more intentional about what we're doing more often.
I'd love to zoom in a little bit about how that mechanism works, how
Sure.
mindfulness can create a moment of opportunity for choice.
Uh-huh.
Could we maybe with an example or just getting really specific
Well,
there?
I think it actually, some of this overlaps with some of the things I do working with kids too. I think a lot of the times in life, what's happening, what's triggering us, whatever's going on in our experience and whatever we're doing about it often seem like they're exactly the same thing. So that, when I'm angry, I do this, or when I'm hungry, I do this. And it seems like that experience of anger and, shutting down or yelling at someone or whatever else it is, everyone has their own habits. They just seem like one and the same. And one of the things that we're practicing, just to come back to, I guess I haven't defined this, the meditation practice part of mindfulness isn't the same as mindfulness. Mindfulness is looking to live life a certain way, and meditation is sort of a way of building the traits we're trying to develop for ourselves. Meditation is it actually is its own way of getting out of autopilot. It's trying to, more actively build traits that we find valuable in essence. So to answer your question then, during meditation, one of the things that's going on is we're just practicing sitting and observing, and then allowing things to just be for a few minutes, leaving things alone for a few minutes. Because that in essence is a practice of observing and then aiming to be intentional, observing and creating a little space. I'm sitting and I'm a little restless now, and I'm a little hungry now. And, some other time when I'm hungry, it's perfectly fine to go to the refrigerator. Right now I'm just practicing, like, what's it like to have something unpleasant like that happen without reacting to it immediately? And there's two implications there that I think are important. I think there's sometimes kind of a fear or a cliche that what mindfulness means is like being okay with everything. I know that comes up a lot. From what I've read, people are concerned when they implement mindfulness in like businesses that, they're encouraging people to just sort of be doormats and be fine. And it really isn't that. What we're aiming for is just seeing things clearly. It's actually meant to be very purposeful, but we're creating enough space to do that, to be intentional about it. So sometimes when you start practicing mindfulness and settling and observing, things can be upsetting. You start noticing something, that you haven't really addressed before, but that's going to be valuable in the long run. And then through it all, and the reason I'm saying that is because during the few minutes of practice, you might choose not to act on it, because that's part of the meditation itself. But that doesn't mean in the future you won't try to take control of a situation that requires it. You'll be very active when you see what actually has to be done.
So is it accurate to say that during meditation, you said we're cultivating different skills,
Mm-hmm.
That one of those that we would be cultivating is this aspect of mindfulness or capacity to see clearly what's really happening, and then that's an opportunity to bring that skill into our life?
Well, I think the hope is that it's going to generalize. I feel like we're talking a lot of abstraction so far, but it really just is that, day to day, moment to moment, things just kind of, like have their own energy to them. Like stress just makes more stress, and we get pulled this way and that way. And then, we end up like, this is just how, I think, I handle homework, and this is just how this moment goes in my relationship. And we get all these, we just sort of get into our groove, to use it. I know it's often used as a positive, but it can be either, really. So what we're aiming to do, I think a lot of the times, the way we're living habitually isn't necessarily, helping us figure things out. I talk about this around health a lot sometimes. It's like, I think we're in a culture where we're often being sold the next big thing. This is the new diet that's going to work. This is the new exercise plan that's going to work. This is you got this like perception that we need more information, more stuff to live healthily. In reality, I think most of us could probably, relatively quickly describe what healthy living would look like. For us, it's individual, but, broadly speaking, we need to eat reasonably healthy. We need to exercise. The concrete facts, they really aren't all that complicated for most of us. And what we can look at instead is mindfulness, is seeing more clearly, like, okay, if that's true, what's standing between me and doing that? Some of it's real, just hours work, all this. Some of it is perception, some of it are just the habits I've gotten into. And what we're practicing with mindfulness is just that ability, and probably many of us have experienced it in different ways in life. I used to experience it backpacking when I used to backpack more, where if you just create a little space to let your thoughts settle, let your brain sort of get out of stress mode and sort of, settle, just sort of shut off the fight or flight response. If you let that happen, a lot of the answers are there. If we can just, pause long enough, in essence, to see them.
So when we're working in situations where we might have a lot of distractions that can really create a quite a scattered state of mind, what are some of your recommendations for how we could use mindfulness or approach that in a way to create opportunities to have that spacious quality?
Well, I think there's two or three different things. And I think, first of all, as much as possible, practicing mindfulness every day, as much as possible, sticking to practicing mindfulness every day, is, as there was a book recently that came out about the research around mindfulness, the science of mindfulness, called Altered Traits. So part of what we're doing is it just becomes familiar. An analogy I sometimes use is, if you wanted to go out and move pianos for a living, you probably, if that was important to you, would want to hit the gym for a while and bulk up. And then when it came time for that work, that would be, easier for you. So the, mindfulness, meditation, the practice of it allows that sort of sense of focus and staying settled to be more part of day-to-day life, just through the everyday practice of it. So part of it is that. And then more specifically, I think we can also, as that becomes familiar, look for shorter moments we can bring into every day. They're sometimes called informal practices, and we can make those routines part of our day, so that maybe when we feel ourselves getting rattled or pulled too many different ways, we just come back to, feet on the floor, or like a short breathing practice, or, focus on just drinking our coffee, without obsessing for a moment, by just focusing on what it's like to drink the coffee. So as it becomes more familiar, we can begin to do the informal practices. And then I also think, like, kind of like the idea I said before about health, sometimes some of the more concrete answers have to do with just re-examining some of the choices we're making, and then maybe, and then making more concrete changes in day-to-day life too. So, for example, there's a lot of people are experiencing the stress of just being on call 24/7. Just this constant, like, notifications and emails and texting. And yet, for most of us, there's an opportunity to manage that if we just sort of step out and look at, like, well, what am I doing because I have to be doing it? And what am I doing because I'm choosing to do it? And maybe we can shut off a lot of our notifications. And, we can, there's a concept called batching, where you just sort of, basically say, except if it's urgent, you just shut everything off for an hour or two, get some work done, and then come back to whatever you have to do next. And there's a lot of, again, that's that same idea. It's just seeing with clarity can just mean recognizing, like, oh, I need that too. And this is the way everyone seems to be living around here, but I'm going to sort of carve out for myself something a little different. And your productivity may go way up just through that. I mean, there's You know, I've seen some articles about life in the business world talking about just the lack of productivity that comes from just our attention going back and forth and pinballing around all the time. You know, that seems inevitable, and yet it's also something our mind doesn't do so effectively. And if we try to live that way, you know, it causes stress, it causes more errors, it decreases the effectiveness of the work we're getting done. So some of, you know, the idea of bringing mindfulness to everyday life is the actual practice, and just trusting that if we practice it, you know, it will become more part of everyday life. And some of it may be those more concrete decisions of, you know, how are we going to manage our smartphones? How are we going to manage, you know, how we set up our day at work and everything else like that.
And what are some of you mentioned the new science that's coming out about mindfulness. What are some of the benefits that are being shown on a mental or physical level of doing this?
Well, I feel pretty, I mean, in a broader sense, I feel pretty lucky just in terms of, you know, I had been practicing for a while, and then really right at the start, I was introduced to mindfulness right before this amazing sort of exponential growth in research around and science around mindfulness that happened almost 20 or 30 years ago now. So that, you know, really, I think there's kind of two ways into, you know, connecting with mindfulness nowadays. To me, you know, a lot of people, just the discussion sounds intuitively helpful. You know, wouldn't it be, you know, look at how you're living. You know, we're sort of on autopilot, not giving things our attention. And some people just connect with it just on the level of, wouldn't it be, you know, it just clicks on kind of a you know, a traditional level. It's been around for centuries in essence. And, you know, there's that level of connection. But there's also now the science of it. And, you know, it's so hard to summarize quickly, but because there's a lot of it. But on the one hand, mindfulness, you know, there's an increasing body of evidence of its value around stress and anxiety. And there's been some studies around things like depression also. You know, I think that, by the way, in terms of the theme of this session, is important to recognize that a lot of that does have to do simply with attention. You know, stress and anxiety often very specifically have to do with not overreacting to something, but with something like grabbing our attention and it won't let go. It's like, you know, so, you know, like something startles you and it was supposed to startle you. That's a good response to have. But if you're prone to anxiety, you know, you just can't stop thinking about it. So some of managing stress and anxiety quite literally has to do with just working with attention, noticing when we're lost and attending to that thought for too long, in essence, and just coming back to, you know, something that's more practically here, like breathing or, you know, your feet on the floor, is a way of working with attention that specifically helps with stress and anxiety. Mindfulness has also been shown to help with many aspects of our physical health. And that's where I think it can start sounding like snake oil if you go too far down that path. But a lot of it just has to do with the fact that chronic unmanaged stress impacts our life and impacts every other medical condition we have, so that when we begin to manage our lives differently, our overall health improves. And some of it may be more specific. A few of those studies had to do with things like the immune response and stuff like that. And then really, I think one of the kind of coolest and engaging parts of research is all the new research having to do with how mindfulness affects the brain. And, you know, we need a lot more to it, but it's really kind of wild. I mean, really different than I was taught when I was in medical school many years ago, because we now know the brain rewires itself based on experience. You know, in many ways, the brain acts like a muscle, which is totally, you know, not how I was taught to think when I first did neurology so many years ago. But it comes back to then, you know, being really, if we can be aware of that, you know, that's where it's really important to be intentional. You know, we can build areas of the brain, it seems, that have to do with focus and attention. We can build areas of the brain that have to do with emotion and compassion, even in a couple of studies. And that's kind of a wild way of thinking about life, but a really important one.
The biggest challenge I always hear from people is that there's not enough time to practice, whether it's like a formal meditation practice or even just the craziness of everyday life one would forget. And so I'm wondering if you have any practical suggestions for carving out that time to either do a formal practice or to integrate these everyday practices that you've been mentioning to prioritize that in our lives.
You know, I think there's a couple of different things to think about around that. There was a study done just recently around exercise. I think it was out of the Rand Institute in Santa Monica, if I'm remembering right. And more or less what they did is they wanted to know how come people just don't have time to exercise, or they want to explore why people, were saying they don't have time to exercise. And, the short of it is it turned out that most people were pretty adamant they didn't have time to exercise, but if you actually tracked their days, had several hours, I think it was up to 4 hours of time that was really, kind of like flex time per day. And then even in spite of knowing that, they still felt they had the perception of they didn't have time to exercise. So some of getting started with a new habit like exercise or like mindfulness is really that sort of, it's kind of its own exercise in mindfulness. It's, these are the assumptions I'm making. This is how I feel, and then these are the facts, and you can sort of look at like, what is actually possible? Is it that it's not a habit yet and that it's difficult, or that it's literally not possible? And I think that is kind of a unique first step to taking to planning in general. It's actually been studied in medicine a little bit too, in that if you ask someone to do something, give them medical advice, and they don't really believe it's important themselves, they're way less likely to do it. So there is an aspect of getting started with mindfulness practice, I think, that can start with just the self-awareness of, what's actually possible here and what's important to me. And if you really, the non-judgmental awareness part of it is understanding that just because it's important to you doesn't mean it's easy to do. So you don't want to blame yourself if it's difficult, but you can just start from that, because, most of us probably can carve out time for 15 minutes, 20 minutes a day of meditation if it was really vital. We could, it's just hard. It's not like I get to, I have days where I forget or I get busy too. And then the second thing I think has to do with habit formation in general, which is just recognizing that anytime we're trying to form a new habit, we have to be really structured with ourselves to make it stick. So open-ended planning, like, sometime tomorrow, if I have time, I'm going to get around to doing this, makes it way less likely to happen. Something else is always going to intrude on that and undermine it and get in the way. So then, if you've decided it's something you really want to try, it comes down to, really look at your day and schedule it. Set yourself reminders and alarms. And then another trick that can be really helpful is, if it's possible, partner with somebody. I don't know if anyone's ever tried that around like a gym program, but if you have like somebody who can hold you accountable, that helps too. And then over time, it becomes more routine in that way. So for the formal practices, that's Gesundheit. For a formal practice, that's what I would typically recommend. And then the informal practices, there are a couple of different ways to look at it. One is generally speaking, as we establish a formal practice, I think the informal practices just become more intuitive. But usually the informal practices relate, so if, for example, I sometimes introduce something, I was thinking of ending with it today too, called the 15 breaths practice, which is just what it sounds. It's just 15 breaths, attending to them as best we're able. It usually takes less than a minute, so it's not a lot of time. And you could do it a few times a day as a way of just settling yourself, on a regular basis, but without necessarily a formal practice. And that's something that if you've been practicing regularly is going to, connect easier. It's just going to be there for you in essence. And then the other side of it, like anything else, is just, there's just kind of a theme to it. There is just the reminders of it. Just set yourself those reminders of, there's so many different types of short in the moment practices that you can come back to. And if there's one that really feels important to you, just make a note for yourself, or just make it pop up on your phone randomly, or, whatever it is. But, but it's all about the repetition and familiarity with it until it just becomes part of everyday life.
I feel like there's this aspect of, especially when starting a new habit, but where it can feel like sitting or having some sort of mindfulness practice can feel like just another thing on your to-do list, and in that way kind of feel like a drag that you don't want to do. In my own experience, sometimes when you get in the flow of it and it's happening more regularly, there can be, sometimes it's challenging, but there can also be a lot of joy in that. And I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions about sort of making it through that tough period, or also not taking it so seriously that it feels like another to-do.
Yeah. I think your second one is the most important one. There's meant to be, and it often doesn't feel that way, but just a lightness to all of mindfulness practice in essence. It's kind of a strange situation to be putting yourself in, starting with meditation itself, which is like, you're sitting down and asking yourself to do this thing, which is actually impossible. So you're never going to do it, there's no perfect and you're never going to get it right, but in the end, your mind's always going to get busy again. And it's a whole, it's sort of you can sort of take it with this attitude of like, there I am again. I can't believe it. Here I am. And, I'm sitting safely here and I just spent another 12 minutes, off, in Canada worrying about that other problem or whatever it is. And there's a lightness you can take to that, almost of like, wow, it's kind of amazing my mind does this. And then there's also an importance of just letting go of just perfection. I mean, there is no perfect to any of this. And that same perspective, so like during meditation practice, there's a thread of self-compassion to any meditation practice, of just like recognizing like, I tried and I got distracted, and then without giving myself a hard time, I'm going to come back, which isn't really how we treat ourselves most of the time day to day when we, get off task and lose our intentions. And we can try to generalize that to just our mindfulness practice as a whole. Like I'm really trying my best to meditate a lot, meditate regularly, and I lost track for a couple of weeks again. And, the most important moment is not giving yourself a hard time, but just in that moment coming back to it. And then I do think, like it sounded like you were alluding to a little bit, and it's similar to physical exercise, that there does tend to be, there's not much more you can do than just patiently, not give yourself a hard time, keep coming back to your plans, realistically evaluate them. Maybe I, need to tweak something. Maybe mornings aren't really going to work. I have to try nights, do that too. But there does tend to be a tipping point. And I think exercise is the same, where there's a point where it's something you're looking forward to a bit, where it just becomes part of life that feels natural, that you don't want to miss. And, and I wish I could say, there's some trick to getting there, but it's about being patient and not worrying too much if you lose track of it, because you're going to, it's more just like, okay, I lost track of it and now I'm going to come back again. And then, and that's really all we ever can do.
So just as in a positive sense that we can make a habit out of our formal meditation practice or everyday mindfulness practices, it also seems like the different skills that we're cultivating during both of those would be really helpful in habit formation in any area of our life, to create habits that are really serving us rather than harming us. And I'd love to hear you speak a little bit to that.
Well, I think in general, first of all, I think what you're alluding to is true. It's actually similar to what I said about health. I mean, the people have written whole books about habit formation. There's all this talk you can do about it. In the end, I think, the core of what goes into it is pretty straightforward. And there aren't a lot of, there's all sorts of tricks you can do working around the edges, but it's just a lot about seeing things clearly and patiently resolving to keep moving, in essence. And one of the things that gets away of any new habit forming, just like we talked about around mindfulness, is that sense of perfectionism. So if you vow to go to the gym 6 times a week, you're probably not going, well, some of you might, but I certainly couldn't. And then if that's your expectation, and that's, and that voice of self-criticism comes up and says you blew it again, you're just going to quit. But if you say, I'm going to start going to the gym, and you pick a reasonable plan, and then you lose touch with it a little bit and come back, you might stick with that over time. And I do think these things interrelate in a way that doesn't get really talked about enough, which is, if the overall intention of mindfulness is to sort of relate to life with resilience, in essence, something along those lines, where, life is going to be up and down and all over the place like it always is, and we're just trying to navigate that as well as we can, I think it's easy to lose touch with, and also, honestly, not always talked about enough around mindfulness, that, our physical health supports our resilience too. And if we want to feel, mentally strong to handle, a challenging stretch of life, exercise and sleep are certainly part of that. Nutrition is probably part of that. And we can, we can bring that same sense of non-judgmental awareness to those parts of our life too. If we can pause long enough to kind of check in and say, like, okay, how much sleep do I really need to be okay? And then how much sleep is possible? I mean, they're like you alluded to around meditation a little bit. It's certainly, possible for a stretch of time. You're not going to sleep as much as you want. But then again, it might just be habit. I'm just staying up late, binge watching shows, and I've been doing it too much lately. And you catch yourself and you make an adjustment, around exercise. There's so much developing research that says like the body just needs to exercise. It's like, it's not like some people are gym people and some people aren't gym people. Regular exercise improves our mental health, improves our physical health. And that same sense of like, well, we all have habits. Like, it doesn't mean you should blame yourself if you've gotten out of a healthy habit, because that's human nature. It just happens. But there's value to that checking in and just sort of catching ourselves, looking at the habits we're living, and then making realistic small steps towards changing them.
A lot of your work has been with bringing mindfulness into home life and working with
Sure.
Kids and teenagers. And so I'm also wondering, specifically in that area, how mindfulness can be a tool to help us engage in our relationships more fully and compassionately.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And I think I'd start just a little more generally, which is a lot of parents nowadays, because mindfulness is so commonly talked about, want to talk about working with kids immediately. And there's an art to slowly getting kids on board with mindfulness. And we just have to trust that as parents, if we're practicing mindfulness, that's influencing everything at home. So I think the answer to your question comes from just recognizing that mindfulness, isn't really a self-help program. I mean, really the core we're going to find if we start practicing mindfulness as a parent and home, really works as a teacher, any caretaker, is that when we are more settled, that's all we can control in any particular situation. And that's going to change everything around us in so many different ways. So, one thing is just being able to give more full attention to our families. I mean, kids, how often do we hear as parents, most of us at times, of like, you're just, Dad, you're not paying attention. Come on, you're not looking at me, and some of it can be pushing for too much attention for sure, but some of it's really real. I mean, you're playing catch, but you're not really playing catch because you're half at work still. So I think that bringing that quality of giving more of life our full attention is something that builds relationships directly in that way. It overlaps often even with behavioral management. One of the first steps towards, helping, I mean, all kids need behavioral management at times, is just giving them positive attention. But what happens when we're on autopilot? When we're on autopilot, we tend to take the things that are going well for granted. So we're racing out the door in the morning, and like 3 or 4 things go fine. Got dressed okay, brushed teeth, cool. Then trying to leave the house without his shoes on, and you're like, what are you doing? And that's the first moment that he might hear anything from you, because you've just been busy and all over the place. But if we're, sort of have this foundation of mindfulness, maybe we can remind ourselves to just check in during the morning, give a little positive feedback along the way. Nice job getting dressed, nice job, and it just creates more balance in that way. So there's like an aspect of it that has to do with that. And then, like a lot of things with mindfulness, there's always another layer you can look at. And certainly another really useful one to look at is that when life gets overly busy and intense, that's where we tend to sort of be very reactive and caught up in habit, which means like stressful things at home just go through the same sort of cycle of reactivity over and over again. So you've been, arguing over homework the entire school year, and maybe after a certain amount of time, you can just catch yourself and realize like, probably not useful to have exactly the same conversation again. And maybe, even in that moment, it's sort of a good analogy for a lot of mindfulness. You might not even know what you want to say differently yet, but the opportunity for doing something differently starts with catching yourself and maybe coming back to a brief mindfulness practice, just settling and realizing I'm just not going to say the same thing again. I don't know what I'm going to say differently, but we're not triggering that, train. We're not getting on that train again, because that's just going the same place it always does. So there's a lot more opportunity to think flexibly, to handle situations differently, to let kids, grow up, because, what worked last year might not work this year. And a lot of that comes from just, letting go and just seeing with clarity, like, okay, whatever's been going on in the big picture right now, I think this may be the thing that makes most sense to say or not say. So all of that just comes from our own practice of mindfulness as parents, even before, you try to expand it to, teaching kids many, many other skills that can come out of mindfulness.
Thank you. And as we're coming too close to the end of the interview, I'm wondering if you would guide us through another practice that would touch on anything that we've talked about today.
Well, I guess I appreciate that. And maybe what we should end with is just that brief practice I mentioned earlier, just the 15 breaths practice. I think, One of the things I didn't say specifically before, because I didn't introduce the practice, is, a lot of what we're looking for when we're focusing on the breath or the body is just, recognizing that in any moment, wherever our emotional state is, wherever our thoughts are, in mindfulness practice, we're not trying to force anything in particular to happen. It's just that our body's here. It's just a way of, grabbing our awareness, attention, wherever it is, and it's just grounding in that way. It's meant to be very literal. We're not trying to breathe differently. So the first time I came across the 15 breaths practice, it was described, in that it takes about a minute for most people. And if you were to do that just once an hour for the whole day, that's like 10 minutes of mindfulness practice, which is pretty perfect. That's a great start. And so it's one of the, I think, really useful ways to just, if you get in the habit of it, let the mind settle for a few seconds to maybe give you some clarity in any given moment. So that's going to be a longer introduction than the practice itself. So let's end with that then. So what we're going to do then is just find ourselves that posture again that we can sit in for a moment or stand in for a moment, and close your eyes or let your gaze drop. And see if you can bring your awareness to that physical sensation of each breath again. And that might be more in your belly and chest, or maybe in the air moving in and out of your nose and mouth. And then as best as you're able, bring your awareness while counting the next 15 breaths. And if your mind wanders off, as it often does, just come back to wherever you last remember. And then for today, wherever you are, opening your eyes. And thank you for participating in all that. I hope that was helpful.